The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Lewis, Lismahago is more paradoxical than ever. The late gulp he had of his native air seems to have blown fresh spirit into all his polemical faculties. I congratulated him the other day on the present flourishing state of his country, observing that the Scots were now in a fair way to wipe off the national reproach of poverty, and expressing my satisfaction at the happy effects of the Union, so conspicuous in the improvement of their agriculture, commerce, manufactures, and manners. The lieutenant, screwing up his features into a look of dissent and disgust, commented on my remarks to this effect: those who reproach a nation for its poverty, when it is not owing to the profligacy or vice of the people, deserve no answer. The Lacedaemonians were poorer than the Scots, when they took the lead among all the free states of Greece, and were esteemed above them all for their valor and their virtue. The most respectable heroes of ancient Rome, such as Fabricius, Cincinnatus, and Regulus, were poorer than the poorest freeholder in Scotland, and there are at this day individuals in North Britain, one of whom can produce more gold and silver than the whole Republic of Rome could raise at those times when her public virtue shone with unrivaled luster, and poverty was so far from being a reproach, that it added fresh laurels to her fame, because it indicated a noble contempt of wealth, which was proof against all the arts of corruption. If poverty be a subject for reproach, it follows that wealth is the object of esteem and veneration. In that case, there are Jews and others in Amsterdam and London, enriched by usury, peculation, and different species of fraud and extortion, who are more estimable than the most virtuous and illustrious members of the community. An absurdity which no man in his senses will offer to maintain. Riches are certainly no proof of merit, nay, they are often, if not most commonly, acquired by persons of sordid minds, and mean talents, nor do they give any intrinsic worth to the possessor, but, on the contrary, tend to pervert his understanding, and render his morals more depraved. But, granting that poverty were really matter of reproach, it cannot be justly imputed to Scotland. No country is poor that can supply its inhabitants with the necessaries of life, and even afford articles for exportation. Scotland is rich in natural advantages. It produces every species of provision in abundance, vast herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, with a great number of horses, prodigious quantities of wool and flax, with plenty of copsewood, and in some parts large forests of timber. The earth is still more rich below than above the surface. It yields inexhaustible stores of coal, freestone, marble, lead, iron, copper, and silver, with some gold. The sea abounds with excellent fish, and salt to cure them for exportation, and there are creeks and harbors round the whole kingdom, for the convenience and security of navigation. The face of the country displays a surprising number of cities, towns, villas, and villages, swarming with people, and there seems to be no want of art, industry, government, and police. Such a kingdom can never be called poor, in any sense of the word, though there may be many others more powerful and opulent. But the proper use of those advantages, and the present prosperity of the Scots, you seem to derive from the union of the two kingdoms. I said, I supposed he would not deny that the appearance of the country was much mended, that the people lived better, had more trade, and a greater quantity of money circulating since the Union, than before. I may safely admit these premises, answered the lieutenant, without subscribing to your inference. The difference you mention, I should take to be the natural progress of improvement. Since that period, other nations, such as the Swedes, the Danes, and in particular the French, have greatly increased in commerce, without any such cause assigned. Before the Union, there was a remarkable spirit of trade among the Scots, as appeared in the case of their Darien Company, in which they had embarked no less than £400,000 sterling, and in the flourishing state of the maritime towns in Fife, and on the eastern coast, enriched by their trade with France, which failed in consequence of the Union. The only solid commercial advantage reaped from that measure, was the privilege of trading to the English plantations, yet, excepting Glasgow and Dumfries. I don't know any other Scotch towns concerned in that traffic. In other respects, I conceive the Scots were losers by the Union. They lost the independency of their state, the greatest prop of national spirit, they lost their parliament, and their courts of justice were subjected to the revision and supremacy of an English tribunal. Softly, Captain, cried I, you cannot be said to have lost your own parliament, while you are represented in that of Great Britain. True, said he, with a sarcastic grin, in debates of national competition, the 16 peers and 45 commoners of Scotland must make a formidable figure in the scale against the whole English legislature. Be that as it may, I observed, while I had the honour to sit in the lower house, the Scotch members had always the majority on their side. I understand you, sir, said he, they generally side with the majority, so much the worse for their constituents. But even this evil is not the worst they have sustained by the Union. Their trade has been saddled with grievous impositions, and every article of living severely taxed, to pay the interest of enormous debts, contracted by the English, in support of measures and connections in which the Scots had no interest nor concern. I begged he would at least allow, that by the Union the Scots were admitted to all the privileges and immunities of English subjects, by which means multitudes of them were provided for in the army and navy, and got fortunes in different parts of England, and its dominions. All these, said he, become English subjects to all intents and purposes, and are in a great measure lost to their mother country. The spirit of rambling and adventure has been always peculiar to the natives of Scotland. If they had not met with encouragement in England, they would have served and settled, as formerly, in other countries, such as Muscovy, Sweden, Denmark, Poland, Germany, France, Piedmont, and Italy, in all which nations their descendants continue to flourish even at this day. By this time my patience began to fail and I exclaimed, for God's sake, what has England got by this union which, you say, has been so productive of misfortune to the Scots? Great and manifold are the advantages which England derives from the Union, said Lismahago, in a solemn tone. First and foremost, the settlement of the Protestant succession, a point which the English ministry drove with such eagerness, that no stone was left unturned, to cajole and bribe a few leading men, to cram the Union down the throats of the Scottish nation, who were surprisingly averse to the expedient. They gained by it a considerable addition of territory, extending their dominion to the sea on all sides of the island, thereby shutting up all back doors against the enterprises of their enemies. They got an accession of above 1 million of useful subjects, constituting a never-failing nursery of seamen, soldiers, laborers, and mechanics, a most valuable acquisition to a trading country, exposed to foreign wars, and obliged to maintain a number of settlements in all the 4 quarters of the globe. In the course of 7 years, during the last war, Scotland furnished the English army and navy with 70,000 men, over and above those who migrated to their colonies, or mingled with them at home in the civil departments of life. This was a very considerable and seasonable supply to a nation, whose people had been for many years decreasing in number, and whose lands and manufactures were actually suffering for want of hands. I need not remind you of the hackneyed maxim, that, to a nation in such circumstances, a supply of industrious people is a supply of wealth, nor repeat an observation, which is now received as an eternal truth, even among the English themselves, that the Scots who settle in South Britain are remarkably sober, orderly, and industrious. I allowed the truth of this remark, adding, that by their industry, economy, and circumspection, many of them in England, as well as in her colonies, amassed large fortunes, with which they returned to their own country, and this was so much lost to South Britain. Give me leave, sir, said he, to assure you, that in your fact you are mistaken, and in your deduction erroneous. Not 1 in 200 that leave Scotland ever returns to settle in his own country, and the few that do return, carry thither nothing that can possibly diminish the stock of South Britain, for none of their treasure stagnates in Scotland. There is a continual circulation, like that of the blood in the human body, and England is the heart, to which all the streams which it distributes are refunded and returned. Nay, in consequence of that luxury which our connection with England hath greatly encouraged, if not introduced, all the produce of our lands, and all the profits of our trade, are engrossed by the natives of South Britain, for you will find that the exchange between the two kingdoms is always against Scotland, and that she retains neither gold nor silver sufficient for her own circulation. The Scots, not content with their own manufactures and produce, which would very well answer all necessary occasions, seem to vie with each other in purchasing superfluities from England, such as broadcloth, velvets, stuffs, silks, lace, furs, jewels, furniture of all sorts, sugar, rum, tea, chocolate and coffee, in a word, not only every mode of the most extravagant luxury, but even many articles of convenience, which they might find as good, and much cheaper in their own country. For all these particulars, I conceive, England may touch about 1,000,000 sterling a year. I don't pretend to make an exact calculation, perhaps, it may be something less, and perhaps, a great deal more. The annual revenue arising from all the private estates of Scotland cannot fall short of 1,000,000 sterling, and, I should imagine, their trade will amount to as much more. I know the linen manufacture alone returns near 500,000, exclusive of the home consumption of that article. If, therefore, North Britain pays a balance of 1,000,000 annually to England, I insist upon it, that country is more valuable to her in the way of commerce, than any colony in her possession, over and above the other advantages which I have specified. Therefore, they are no friends, either to England or to truth, who affect to depreciate the northern part of the United Kingdom. I must own, I was at first a little nettled to find myself schooled in so many particulars. Though I did not receive all his assertions as gospel, I was not prepared to refute them, and I cannot help now acquiescing in his remarks so far as to think, that the contempt for Scotland, which prevails too much on this side the Tweed, is founded on prejudice and error. After some recollection, "Well, Captain," said I, "you have argued stoutly for the importance of your own country. For my part, I have such a regard for our fellow subjects of North Britain, that I shall be glad to see the day, when your peasants can afford to give all their oats to their cattle, hogs, and poultry, and indulge themselves with good wheaten loaves, instead of such poor, unpalatable, and inflammatory diet." Here again I brought myself into a praemunire with the disputative Caledonian. He said he hoped he should never see the common people lifted out of that sphere for which they were intended by nature and the course of things, that they might have some reason to complain of their bread, if it were mixed, like that of Norway, with sawdust and fish bones, but that oatmeal was, he apprehended, as nourishing and salutary as wheat flour, and the Scots in general thought it at least as savoury. He affirmed, that a mouse, which, in the article of self-preservation, might be supposed to act from infallible instinct, would always prefer oats to wheat, as appeared from experience, for, in a place where there was a parcel of each, that animal has never begun to feed upon the latter till all the oats were consumed. For their nutritive quality, he appealed to the hale, robust constitutions of the people who lived chiefly upon oatmeal, and, instead of being inflammatory, he asserted, that it was a cooling subacid, balsamic and mucilaginous, insomuch, that in all inflammatory distempers, recourse was had to water gruel, and flummery made of oatmeal. At least, said I, give me leave to wish them such a degree of commerce as may enable them to follow their own inclinations. Heaven forbid! Cried this philosopher. Woe be to that nation, where the multitude is at liberty to follow their own inclinations. Commerce is, undoubtedly, a blessing, while restrained within its proper channels, but a glut of wealth brings along with it a glut of evils. It brings false taste, false appetite, false wants, profusion, venality, contempt of order, engendering a spirit of licentiousness, insolence, and faction, that keeps the community in continual ferment, and in time destroys all the distinctions of civil society, so that universal anarchy and uproar must ensue. Will any sensible man affirm that the national advantages of opulence are to be sought on these terms? No, sure, but I am one of those who think that, by proper regulations, commerce may produce every national benefit, without the allay of such concomitant evils. So much for the dogmata of my friend Lismahago, whom I describe the more circumstantially, as I firmly believe he will set up his rest in Monmouthshire. Yesterday, while I was alone with him, he asked, in some confusion, if I should have any objection to the success of a gentleman and a soldier, provided he should be so fortunate as to engage my sister's affection. I answered without hesitation, that my sister was old enough to judge for herself, and that I should be very far from disapproving any resolution she might take in his favor. His eyes sparkled at this declaration. He declared he should think himself the happiest man on earth to be connected with my family, and that he should never be weary of giving me proofs of his gratitude and attachment. I suppose Tabby and he are already agreed, in which case, we shall have a wedding at Brambleton Hall, and you shall give away the bride. It is the least thing you can do, by way of atonement for your former cruelty to that poor lovesick maiden, who has been so long a thorn in the side of yours, Matt. Bramble, September 20th. We have been at Buxton, but, as I did not much relish either the company or the accommodations, and had no occasion for the water, we to Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. Of Jesus College, Uxon. Dear Wat, adventures begin to thicken as we advance to the southward. Lismahago has now professed himself the admirer of our aunt, and carries on his addresses under the sanction of her brother's approbation, so that we shall certainly have a wedding by Christmas. I should be glad you was present at the nuptials, to help me throw the stocking, and perform other ceremonies peculiar to that occasion. I am sure it will be productive of some diversion, and, truly, it would be worth your while to come across the country on purpose to see two such original figures in bed together, with their lace night-caps, he, the emblem of good cheer, and she, the picture of good nature. All this agreeable prospect was clouded, and had well nigh vanished, entirely, in consequence of a late misunderstanding between the future brothers-in-law, which, however, is now happily removed. A few days ago, my uncle and I, going to visit a relation, met with Lord Oxmington at his house, who asked us to dine with him next day, and we accepted the invitation, accordingly, leaving our women under the care of Captain Lismahago, at the inn where we had lodged, the preceding night, in a little town, about a mile from his lordship's dwelling. We went at the hour appointed, and had a fashionable meal served up with much ostentation to a company of about a dozen persons, none of whom he had ever seen before. His lordship is much more remarkable for his pride and caprice, than for his hospitality and understanding, and, indeed, it appeared, that he considered his guests merely as objects to shine upon, so as to reflect the luster of his own magnificence. There was much state, but no courtesy, and a great deal of compliment without any conversation. Before the dessert was removed, our noble entertainer proposed 3 general toasts, then calling for a glass of wine, and bowing all round, wished us a good afternoon. This was the signal for the company to break up, and they obeyed it immediately, all except our squire, who was greatly shocked at the manner of this dismission. He changed countenance, bit his lip in silence, but still kept his seat, so that his lordship found himself obliged to give us another hint, by saying, he should be glad to see us another time. There is no time like the present, cried Mr. Bramble. Your lordship has not yet drank a bumper to the best in Christendom. I'll drink no more bumpers today, answered our landlord, and I am sorry to see you have drank too many. Order the gentleman's carriage to the gate. So saying, he rose and retired abruptly, our squire starting up at the same time, laying his hand upon his sword, and eyeing him with a most ferocious aspect. The master having vanished in this manner, our uncle bade one of the servants to see what was to pay, and the fellow answering, "This is no inn, I cry you mercy," cried the other, "I perceive it is not, if it were, the landlord would be more civil. There's a guinea, however, take it, and tell your lord, that I shall not leave the country till I have had the opportunity to thank him in person for his politeness and hospitality." We then walked downstairs through a double range of lacqueys, and getting into the chaise, proceeded homewards. Perceiving the squire much ruffled, I ventured to disapprove of his resentment, observing, that as Lord Oxmington was well known to have his brain very ill-timbered, a sensible man should rather laugh, than be angry at his ridiculous want of breeding. Mr. Bramble took umbrage at my presuming to be wiser than he upon this occasion, and told me, that as he had always thought for himself in every occurrence in life, he would still use the same privilege, with my good leave. When we returned to our inn, he closeted Lismahago, and having explained his grievance, desired that gentleman to go and demand satisfaction of Lord Oxmington in his name. The lieutenant charged himself with this commission, and immediately set out a horseback for his lordship's house, attended, at his own request, by my man Archie McAlpine, who had been used to military service, and truly, if McAlpine had been mounted upon an ass, this couple might have passed for the Knight of La Mancha and his squire Panza. It was not till after some demur that Lismahago obtained a private audience, at which he formally defied his lordship to single combat, in the name of Mr. Bramble, and desired him to appoint the time and place. Lord Oxmington was so confounded at this unexpected message, that he could not, for some time, make any articulate reply, but stood staring at the lieutenant with manifest marks of perturbation. At length, ringing a bell with great vehemence, he exclaimed, "What? A commoner, send a challenge to appear of the realm!" Privilege. Privilege, here's a person brings me a challenge from the Welshman that dined at my table, an impudent fellow. My wine is not yet out of his head. The whole house was immediately in commotion. McAlpine made a soldierly retreat with 2 horses, but the captain was suddenly surrounded and disarmed by the footman, whom a French valet de chambre headed in this exploit. His sword was passed through a close stool, and his person through the horsepond. In this plight he returned to the inn, half mad with his disgrace. So violent was the rage of his indignation, that he mistook its object. He wanted to quarrel with Mr. Bramble, he said. He had been dishonored on his account, and he looked for reparation at his hands. My uncle's back was up, in a moment, and he desired him to explain his pretensions. "Either compel Lord Oxmington to give me satisfaction," cried he, "or give it me in your own person." "The latter part of the alternative is the most easy and expeditious," replied the squire, starting up. "If you are disposed for a walk, I'll attend you this moment." Here they were interrupted by Mrs. Tabby, who had overheard all that passed. She now burst into the room, and running betwixt them, in great agitation, "Is this your regard for me," said she to the lieutenant, "to seek the life of my brother?" Lismahago, who seemed to grow cool as my uncle grew hot, assured her he had a very great respect for Mr. Bramble, but he had still more for his own honor, which had suffered pollution, but if that could be once purified, he should have no further cause of dissatisfaction. The squire said, he should have thought it incumbent upon him to vindicate the lieutenant's honor, but, as he had now carved for himself, he might swallow and digest it as well as he could. In a word, what betwixt the mediation of Mrs. Tabitha, the recollection of the captain, who perceived he had gone too far, and the remonstrances of your humble servant, who joined them at this juncture, those 2 originals were perfectly reconciled, and then we proceeded to deliberate upon the means of taking vengeance for the insults they had received from the petulant peer, for, until that aim should be accomplished, Mr. Bramble swore, with great emphasis, that he would not leave the inn where we now lodged, even if he should pass his Christmas on the spot. In consequence of our deliberations, we next day, in the forenoon, proceeded in a body to his lordship's house, all of us, with our servants, including the coachman, mounted horseback, with our pistols loaded and ready primed. Thus prepared for action, We paraded solemnly and slowly before his lordship's gate, which we passed 3 times in such a manner, that he could not but see us, and suspect the cause of our appearance. After dinner we returned, and performed the same cavalcade, which was again repeated the morning following, but we had no occasion to persist in these manoeuvres. About noon, we were visited by the gentleman, at whose house we had first seen Lord Oxmington. He now came to make apologies in the name of his lordship, who declared he had no intention to give offence to my uncle, in practicing what had been always the custom of his house, and that as for the indignities which had been put upon the officer, they were offered without his lordship's knowledge, at the instigation of his valet de chambre. If that be the case, said my uncle, in a peremptory tone, I shall be contented with Lord Oxmington's personal excuses, and I hope my friend will be satisfied with his lordship's turning that insolent rascal out of his service. Sir, cried Lismahago, I must insist upon taking personal vengeance for the personal injuries I have sustained. After some debate, the affair was adjusted in this manner. His lordship, meeting us at our friend's house, declared he was sorry for what had happened, and that he had no intention to give umbrage. The valet de chambre asked pardon of the lieutenant upon his knees, when Lismahago, to the astonishment of all present, gave him a violent kick on the face, which laid him on his back, exclaiming in a furious tone, "We gt pardon, gens foutre." Such was the fortunate issue of this perilous adventure, which threatened abundance of vexation to our family, for the squire is one of those who will sacrifice both life and fortune, rather than leave what they conceive to be the least speck or blemish upon their honour and reputation. His lordship had no sooner pronounced his apology, with a very bad grace, than he went away in some disorder, and, I dare say, he will never invite another Welshman to his table. We forthwith quitted the field of this achievement, in order to prosecute our journey, but we follow no determinate course. We make small deviations, to see the remarkable towns, villas, and curiosities on each side of our route, so that we advance by slow steps towards the borders of Monmouthshire, but in the midst of these irregular motions, there is no aberration nor eccentricity in that affection with which I am, dear Wat, yours always, J. Melford. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Dick, at what time of life may a man think himself exempted from the necessity of sacrificing his repose to the punctilios of a contemptible world? I have been engaged in a ridiculous adventure, which I shall recount at meeting, and this, I hope, will not be much longer delayed, as we have now performed almost all our visits, and seen everything that I think has any right to retard us in our journey homewards. A few days ago, understanding by accident that my old friend Baynard was in the country, I would not pass so near his habitation without paying him a visit, though our correspondence had been interrupted for a long course of years. I felt myself very sensibly affected by the idea of our past intimacy, as we approached the place where we had spent so many happy days together, but when we arrived at the house, I could not recognize any one of those objects, which had been so deeply impressed upon my remembrance. The tall oaks that shaded the avenue had been cut down, and the iron gates at the end of it removed, together with the high wall that surrounded the courtyard. The house itself, which was formerly a convent of Cistercian monks, had a venerable appearance, and along the front that looked into the garden, was a stone gallery, which afforded me many an agreeable walk, when I was disposed to be contemplative. Now the old front is covered with a screen of modern architecture, so that all without is Grecian, and all within Gothic. As for the garden, which was well stocked with the best fruit which England could produce, there is not now the least vestige remaining of trees, walls, or hedges. Nothing appears but a naked circus of loose sand, with a dry basin and a leaden triton in the middle. You must know, that Baynard, at his father's death, had a clear estate of £1,500 a year, and was in other respects extremely well qualified to make a respectable figure in the Commonwealth, but, what with some excesses of youth, and the expense of a contested election, he in a few years found himself encumbered with a debt of £10,000, which he resolved to discharge by means of a prudent marriage. He accordingly married a Miss Thompson, whose fortune amounted to double the sum that he owed. She was the daughter of a citizen, who had failed in trade, but her fortune came by an uncle, who died in the East Indies. Her own parents being dead, she lived with a maiden aunt, who had superintended her education, and, in all appearance, was well enough qualified for the usual purposes of the married state. Her virtues, however, stood rather upon a negative than a positive foundation. She was neither proud, insolent, nor capricious, nor given to scandal, nor addicted to gaming, nor inclined to gallantry. She could read, and write, and dance, and sing, and play upon the harpsichord, and smatter French, and take a hand at whist and ombre, but even these accomplishments she possessed by halves. She excelled in nothing. Her conversation was flat, her style mean, and her expression embarrassed. In a word, her character was totally insipid. Her person was not disagreeable, but there was nothing graceful in her address, nor engaging in her manners, and she was so ill qualified to do the honors of the house, that when she sat at the head of the table, one was always looking for the mistress of the family in some other place. Baynard had flattered himself that it would be no difficult matter to mold such a subject after his own fashion, and that she would cheerfully enter into his views, which were wholly turned to domestic happiness. He proposed to reside always in the country, of which he was fond to a degree of enthusiasm, to cultivate his estate, which was very improvable, to enjoy the exercise of rural diversions, to maintain an intimacy of correspondence with some friends that were settled in his neighborhood, to keep a comfortable house, without suffering his expense to exceed the limits of his income, and to find pleasure and employ merit for his wife in the management and avocations of her own family. This, however, was a visionary scheme, which he never was able to realize. His wife was as ignorant as a newborn babe of everything that related to the conduct of a family, and she had no idea of a country life. Her understanding did not reach so far as to comprehend the first principles of discretion, and, indeed, if her capacity had been better than it was, her natural indolence would not have permitted her to abandon a certain routine, to which she had been habituated. She had not taste enough to relish any rational enjoyment, but her ruling passion was vanity, not that species which arises from self-conceit of superior accomplishments, but that, which is of a bastard and idiot nature, excited by show and ostentation, which implies not even the least consciousness of any personal merit. The nuptial peal of noise and nonsense being rung out in all the usual changes, Mr. Baynard thought it high time to make her acquainted with the particulars of the plan which he had projected. He told her that his fortune, though sufficient to afford all the comforts of life, was not ample enough to command all the superfluities of pomp and pageantry, which, indeed, were equally absurd and intolerable. He therefore hoped she would have no objection to their leaving London in the spring, when he would take the opportunity to dismiss some unnecessary domestics, whom he had hired for the occasion of their marriage. She heard him in silence, and after some pause, "So," said she, "I am to be buried in the country." He was so confounded at this reply, that he could not speak for some minutes. At length he told her, he was much mortified to find he had proposed anything that was disagreeable to her ideas. "I am sure," added he, "I meant nothing more than to lay down a comfortable plan of living within the bounds of our fortune, which is but moderate." "Sir," said she, "you are the best judge of your own affairs. My fortune, I know, does not exceed £20,000, yet, even with that pittance, I might have had a husband who would not have begrudged me a house in London. Good God!" "My dear," cried poor Baynard, in the utmost agitation, "you don't think me so sordid. I only hinted what I thought, but I don't pretend to impose." "Yes, sir," resumed the lady, "it is your prerogative to command, and my duty to obey." So saying, she burst into tears and retired to her chamber, where she was joined by her aunt. He endeavored to recollect himself, and act with vigor of mind on this occasion, but was betrayed by the tenderness of his nature, which was the greatest defect of his constitution. He found the aunt in tears, and the niece in a fit, which held her the best part of 8 hours, at the expiration of which, she began to talk incoherently about death and her dear husband, who had sat by her all this time, and now pressed her hand to his lips, in a transport of grief and penitence for the offence he had given. From thenceforward, he carefully avoided mentioning the country, and they continued to be sucked deeper and deeper into the vortex of extravagance and dissipation, leading what is called a fashionable life in town. About the latter end of July, however, Mrs. Baynard, in order to exhibit a proof of conjugal obedience, desired of her own accord, that they might pay a visit to his country house, as there was no company left in London. He would have excused himself from this excursion, which was no part of the economical plan he had proposed, but she insisted upon making this sacrifice to his taste and prejudices, and away they went with such an equipage as astonished the whole country. All that remained of the season was engrossed by receiving and returning visits in the neighbourhood, and, in this intercourse, it was discovered that Sir John Chickwell had a house steward and 1 footman in livery more than the complement of Mr. Baynard's household. This remark was made by the aunt at table, and assented to by the husband, who observed that Sir John Chickwell might very well afford to keep more servants than were found in the family of a man who had not half his fortune. Mrs. Baynard ate no supper that evening, but was seized with a violent fit, which completed her triumph over the spirit of her consort. The 2 supernumerary servants were added, the family plate was sold for old silver, and a new service procured, fashionable furniture was provided, and the whole house turned topsy-turvy. At their return to London in the beginning of winter, he, with a heavy heart, communicated these particulars to me in confidence. Before his marriage, he had introduced me to the lady as his particular friend, and I now offered in that character, to lay before her the necessity of reforming her economy, if she had any regard to the interest of her own family, or complaisance for the inclinations of her husband. But Baynard declined my offer, on the supposition that his wife's nerves were too delicate to bear expostulation, and that it would only serve to overwhelm her with such distress as would make himself miserable. Baynard is a man of spirit, and had she proved a termagant, he would have known how to deal with her, but, either by accident or instinct, she fastened upon the weak side of his soul, and held it so fast, that he has been in subjection ever since. I afterwards advised him to carry her abroad to France or Italy, where he might gratify her vanity for half the expense it cost him in England, and this advice he followed accordingly. She was agreeably flattered with the idea of seeing and knowing foreign parts, and foreign fashions, of being presented to sovereigns, and living familiarly with princes. She forthwith seized the hint which I had thrown out on purpose, and even pressed Mr. Baynard to hasten his departure, so that in a few weeks they crossed the sea to France, with a moderate train, still including the aunt, who was her bosom counsellor, and abetted her in all her oppositions to her husband's will. Since that period, I have had little or no opportunity to renew our former correspondence. All that I knew of his transactions amounted to no more than that after an absence of 2 years, they returned so little improved in economy, that they launched out into new oceans of extravagance, which at length obliged him to mortgage his estate. By this time she had bore him 3 children, of which the last only survives, a puny boy of 12 or 13, who will be ruined in his education by the indulgence of his mother. As for Baynard, neither his own good sense, nor the dread of indigence, nor the consideration of his children, has been a force sufficient to stimulate him into the resolution of breaking at once the shameful spell by which he seems enchanted, with a taste capable of the most refined enjoyment, a heart glowing with all the warmth of friendship and humanity, and a disposition strongly turned to the more rational pleasures of a retired and country life. He is hurried about in a perpetual tumult, amidst a mob of beings pleased with rattles, baubles, and gewgaws, so void of sense and distinction, that even the most acute philosopher would find it a very hard task to discover for what wise purpose of Providence they were created. Friendship is not to be found, nor can the amusements for which he sighs be enjoyed within the rotation of absurdity, to which he is doomed for life. He has long resigned all views of improving his fortune by management and attention to the exercise of husbandry, in which he delighted, and as to domestic happiness, not the least glimpse of hope remains to amuse his imagination. Thus blasted in all his prospects, he could not fail to be overwhelmed with melancholy and chagrin, which have preyed upon his health and spirits in such a manner, that he is now threatened with a consumption. I have given you a sketch of the man, whom the other day I went to visit. At the gate we found a great number of powdered lacqueys, but no civility. After we had sat a considerable time in the coach, we were told that Mr. Baynard had rode out, and that his lady was dressing, but we were introduced to a parlour, so very fine and delicate, that in all appearance it was designed to be seen only, not inhabited. The chairs and couches were carved, gilt, and covered with rich damask, so smooth and slick, that they looked as if they had never been sat upon. There was no carpet upon the floor, but the boards were rubbed and waxed in such a manner, that we could not walk, but were obliged to slide along them, and as for the stove, it was too bright and polished to be polluted with sea coal, or stained by the smoke of any gross material fire. When we had remained above half an hour sacrificing to the inhospitable powers in the temple of cold reception, my friend Baynard arrived, and understanding we were in the house, made his appearance, so meagre, yellow, and dejected, that I really should not have known him, had I met with him in any other place. Running up to me, with great eagerness, he strained me in his embrace, and his heart was so full, that for some minutes he could not speak. Having saluted us all round, he perceived our uncomfortable situation, and conducting us into another apartment, which had fire in the chimney, called for chocolate. Then, withdrawing, he returned with a compliment from his wife, and, in the meantime, presented his son Harry, a shambling, blear-eyed boy, in the habit of a hussar, very rude, forward, and impertinent. His father would have sent him to a boarding school, but his mamma and aunt would not hear of his lying out of the house, so that there was a clergyman engaged as his tutor in the family. As it was but just turned of 12, and the whole house was in commotion to prepare a formal entertainment, I foresaw it would be late before we dined, and proposed a walk to Mr. Baynard, that we might converse together freely. In the course of this perambulation, when I expressed some surprise that he had returned so soon from Italy, he gave me to understand that his going abroad had not at all answered the purpose for which he left England, that although the expense of living was not so great in Italy as at home, respect being had to the same rank of life in both countries, it had been found necessary for him to lift himself above his usual style, that he might be on some footing with the counts, marquises, and cavaliers, with whom he kept company. He was obliged to hire a great number of servants, to take off a great variety of rich clothes, and to keep a sumptuous table for the fashionable scorachini of the country, who, without a consideration of this kind, would not have paid any attention to an untitled foreigner, let his family or fortune be ever so respectable. Besides, Mrs. Baynard was continually surrounded by a train of expensive loungers, under the denominations of language masters, musicians, painters, and ciceroni, and had actually fallen into the disease of buying pictures and antiques upon her own judgment, which was far from being infallible. At length she met with an affront, which gave her disgust to Italy, and drove her back to England with some precipitation. By means of frequenting the Duchess of Bedford's conversation, while her Grace was at Rome, Mrs. Baynard became acquainted with all the fashionable people of that city, and was admitted to their assemblies without scruple. Thus favored, she conceived too great an idea of her own importance, and when the Duchess left Rome, resolved to have a conversation that should leave the Romans no room to regret her Grace's departure. She provided hands for a musical entertainment, and sent biglietti of invitation to every person of distinction, but not one Roman of the female sex appeared at her assembly. She was that night seized with a violent fit, and kept her bed 3 days, at the expiration of which she declared that the air of Italy would be the ruin of her constitution. In order to prevent this catastrophe, she was speedily removed to Geneva, from whence they returned to England by the way of Lyons and Paris. By the time they arrived at Calais, she had purchased such a quantity of silks, stuffs, and laces, that it was necessary to hire a vessel to smuggle them over, and this vessel was taken by a custom-house cutter, so that they lost the whole cargo, which had cost them above £800. It now appears that her travels had produced no effect upon her, but that of making her more expensive and fantastic than ever. She affected to lead the fashion, not only in point of female dress, but in every article of taste and connoisseurship. She made a drawing of the new facade to the house in the country, she pulled up the trees, and pulled down the walls of the garden, so as to let in the easterly wind, which Mr. Baynard's ancestors had been at great pains to exclude. To show her taste in laying out ground, she seized into her own hand a farm of 200 acres, about a mile from the house, which she parcelled out into walks and shrubberies, having a great basin in the middle, into which she poured a whole stream that turned 2 mills, and afforded the best trout in the country. The bottom of the basin, however, was so ill secured, that it would not hold the water which strained through the earth, and made a bog of the whole plantation. In a word, the ground which formerly paid him £150 a year, now cost him £200 a year to keep it in tolerable order, over and above the first expense of trees, shrubs, flowers, turf, and gravel. There was not an inch of garden ground left about the house, nor a tree that produced fruit of any kind, nor did he raise a truss of hay, or a bushel of oats for his horses, nor had he a single cow to afford milk for his tea. Far less did he ever dream of feeding his own mutton, pigs, and poultry. Every article of housekeeping, even the most inconsiderable, was brought from the next market town, at the distance of 5 miles, and thither they sent a courier every morning to fetch hot rolls for breakfast. In short, Baynard fairly owned that he spent double his income, and that in a few years he should be obliged to sell his estate for the payment of his creditors. He said that his wife had such delicate nerves, and such imbecility of spirit, that she could neither bear remonstrance, be it ever so gentle, nor practice any scheme of retrenchment, even if she perceived the necessity of such a measure. He had therefore ceased struggling against the stream, and endeavored to reconcile himself to ruin, by reflecting that his child at least would inherit his mother's fortune, which was secured to him by the contract of marriage. The detail which he gave me of his affairs, filled me at once with grief and indignation. I inveighed bitterly against the indiscretion of his wife, and reproached him with his unmanly acquiescence under the absurd tyranny which she exerted. I exhorted him to recollect his resolution, and make one effectual effort to disengage himself from a thraldom, equally shameful and pernicious. I offered him all the assistance in my power. I undertook to regulate his affairs, and even to bring about a reformation in his family, if he would only authorize me to execute the plan I should form for his advantage. I was so affected by the subject, that I could not help mingling tears with my remonstrances, and Baynard was so penetrated with these marks of my affection, that he lost all power of utterance. He pressed me to his breast with great emotion, and wept in silence. At length he exclaimed, "Friendship is undoubtedly the most precious balm of life. Your words, dear Bramble, have in a great measure recalled me from an abyss of despondence, in which I have been long overwhelmed. I will, upon honor, make you acquainted with a distinct state of my affairs, and, as far as I am able to go, will follow the course you prescribe. But there are certain lengths which my nature, the truth is, there are tender connections, of which a bachelor has no idea. Shall I own my weakness? I cannot bear the thoughts of making that woman uneasy, and yet," cried I, "she has seen you unhappy for a series of years, unhappy from her misconduct, without ever showing the least inclination to alleviate your distress. Nevertheless," said he, "I am persuaded she loves me with the most warm affection, but these are incongruities in the composition of the human mind which I hold to be inexplicable." I was shocked at his infatuation, and changed the subject, after we had agreed to maintain a close correspondence for the future. He then gave me to understand that he had two neighbors, who, like himself, were driven by their wives at full speed, in the high road to bankruptcy and ruin. All the three husbands were of dispositions very different from each other, and, according to this variation, their consorts were admirably suited to the purpose of keeping them all three in subjection. The views of the ladies were exactly the same. They vied in grandeur, that is, in ostentation, with the wife of Sir Charles Chickwell, who had 4 times their fortune, and she again piqued herself upon making an equal figure with a neighbouring peeress, whose revenue trebled her own. Here then was the fable of the frog and the ox, realized in 4 different instances within the same county, 1 large fortune, and 3 moderate estates, in a fair way of being burst by the inflation of female vanity, and in 3 of these instances, 3 different forms of female tyranny were exercised. Mr. Baynard was subjugated by practicing upon the tenderness of his nature. Mr. Milkson, being of a timorous disposition, truckled to the insolence of a termagant. Mr. Sowerby, who was of a temper neither to be moved by fits, nor driven by menaces, had the fortune to be fitted with a helpmate, who assailed him with the weapons of irony and satire, sometimes sneering in the way of compliment, sometimes throwing out sarcastic comparisons, implying reproaches upon his want of taste, spirit, and generosity, by which means she stimulated his passions from one act of extravagance to another, just as the circumstances of her vanity required. All these 3 ladies have at this time the same number of horses, carriages, and servants in and out of livery, the same variety of dress, the same quantity of plate and china, the like ornaments in furniture, and in their entertainments they endeavor to exceed one another in the variety, delicacy, and expense of their dishes. I believe it will be found upon inquiry, that 19 out of 20, who are ruined by extravagance, fall a sacrifice to the ridiculous pride and vanity of silly women, whose parts are held in contempt by the very men whom they pillage and enslave. Thank heaven, Dick, that among all the follies and weaknesses of human nature, I have not yet fallen into that of matrimony. After Baynard and I had discussed all these matters at leisure, we returned towards the house, and met Jery with our 2 women, who had come forth to take the air, as the lady of the mansion had not yet made her appearance. In short, Mrs. Baynard did not produce herself, till about a quarter of an hour before dinner was upon the table. Then her husband brought her into the parlour, accompanied by her aunt and son, and she received us with a coldness of reserve sufficient to freeze the very soul of hospitality. Though she knew I had been the intimate friend of her husband, and had often seen me with him in London, she showed no marks of recognition or regard, when I addressed myself to her in the most friendly terms of salutation. She did not even express the common compliment of, "I am glad to see you," or, "I hope you have enjoyed your health since we had the pleasure of seeing you," or some such words of course, nor did she once open her mouth in the way of welcome to my sister and my niece, but sat in silence like a statue, with an aspect of insensibility. Her aunt, the model upon which she had been formed, was indeed the very essence of insipid formality, but the boy was very pert and impudent, and prated without ceasing. At dinner, the lady maintained the same ungracious indifference, never speaking but in whispers to her aunt, and as to the repast, it was made up of a parcel of kickshaws, contrived by a French cook, without one substantial article adapted to the satisfaction of an English appetite. The pottage was little better than bread soaked in dish-washings, lukewarm. The ragouts looked as if they had been once eaten and half digested, the fricassees were involved in a nasty yellow poultice, and the rôtis were scorched and stinking, for the honour of the fumet. The dessert consisted of faded fruit and iced froth, a good emblem of our landlady's character. The table beer was sour, the water foul, and the wine vapid, but there was a parade of plate and china, and a powdered lackey stood behind every chair, except those of the master and mistress of the house, who were served by 2 valets dressed like gentlemen. We dined in a large old Gothic parlour, which was formerly the hall. It was now paved with marble, and, notwithstanding the fire which had been kindled about an hour, struck me with such a chill sensation, that when I entered it the teeth chattered in my jaws. In short, everything was cold, comfortless, and disgusting, except the looks of my friend Baynard, which declared the warmth of his affection and humanity. After dinner we withdrew into another apartment, where the boy began to be impertinently troublesome to my niece Liddy. He wanted a playfellow, forsooth, and would have romped with her, had she encouraged his advances. He was even so impudent as to snatch a kiss, at which she changed countenance, and seemed uneasy, and though his father checked him for the rudeness of his behavior, he became so outrageous as to thrust his hand in her bosom, an insult, to which she did not tamely submit, though one of the mildest creatures upon earth. Her eyes sparkling with resentment, she started up, and lent him such a box in the ear, as sent him staggering to the other side of the room. "Miss Melford," cried his father, "you have treated him with the utmost propriety. I am only sorry that the impertinence of any child of mine should have occasioned this exertion of your spirit, which I cannot but applaud and admire." His wife was so far from assenting to the candor of his apology, that she rose from the table, and, taking her son by the hand, "Come, child," said she, "your father cannot abide you." So saying, she retired with this hopeful youth, and was followed by her gouvernante, but neither the one nor the other deigned to take the least notice of the company. Baynard was exceedingly disconcerted, but I perceived his uneasiness was tinctured with resentment, and derived a good omen from this discovery. I ordered the horses to be put to the carriage, and, though he made some efforts to detain us all night, I insisted upon leaving the house immediately, but, before I went away, I took an opportunity of speaking to him again in private. I said everything I could recollect, to animate his endeavors in shaking off those shameful trommels. I made no scruple to declare that his wife was unworthy of that tender complaisance which he had shown for her foibles, that she was dead to all the genuine sentiments of conjugal affection, insensible of her own honor and interest, and seemingly destitute of common sense and reflection. I conjured him to remember what he owed to his father's house, to his own reputation, and to his family, including even this unreasonable woman herself, who was driving on blindly to her own destruction. I advised him to form a plan for retrenching superfluous expense, and try to convince the aunt of the necessity for such a reformation, that she might gradually prepare her niece for its execution, and I exhorted him to turn that disagreeable piece of formality out of the house, if he should find her averse to his proposal. Here he interrupted me with a sigh, observing that such a step would undoubtedly be fatal to Mrs. Baynard. "I shall lose all patience," cried I, "to hear you talk so weakly. Mrs. Baynard's fits will never hurt her constitution. I believe in my conscience they are all affected. I am sure she has no feeling for your distresses, and, when you are ruined, she will appear to have no feeling for her own." Finally, I took his word and honor that he would make an effort, such as I had advised, that he would form a plan of economy, and, if he found it impracticable without my assistance, he would come to Bath in the winter, where I promised to give him the meeting, and contribute all in my power to the retrieval of his affairs. With this mutual engagement we parted, and I shall think myself supremely happy, if, by my means, a worthy man, whom I love and esteem, can be saved from misery, disgrace, and despair. I have only one friend more to visit in this part of the country, but he is of a complexion very different from that of Baynard. You have heard me mention Sir Thomas Bulford, whom I knew in Italy. He is now become a country gentleman, but, being disabled by the gout from enjoying any amusement abroad, he entertains himself within doors, by keeping open house for all corners, and playing upon the oddities and humors of his company, but he himself is generally the greatest original at his table. He is very good-humored, talks much, and laughs without ceasing. I am told that all the use he makes of his understanding at present, is to excite mirth, by exhibiting his guests in ludicrous attitudes. I know not how far we may furnish him with entertainment of this kind, but I am resolved to beat up his quarters, partly with a view to laugh with the knight himself, and partly to pay my respects to his lady, a good-natured sensible woman, with whom he lives, upon very easy terms, although she has not had the good fortune to bring him an heir to his estate. And now, dear Dick, I must tell you for your comfort, that you are the only man upon earth to whom I would presume to send such a long-winded epistle, which I could not find in my heart to curtail, because the subject interested the warmest passions of my heart. Neither will I make any other apology, to a correspondent who has been so long accustomed to the To Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. At Oxon. Dear Knight, I believe there is something mischievous in my disposition, for nothing diverts me so much as to see certain characters tormented with false terrors. We last night lodged at the house of Sir Thomas Bulford, an old friend of my uncle, a jolly fellow, of moderate intellects, who, in spite of the gout, which hath lamed him, is resolved to be merry, to the last, and mirth he has a particular knack in extracting from his guests, let their humour be ever so caustic or refractory. Besides our company, there was in the house a fat-headed justice of the peace, called Frogmore, and a country practitioner in surgery, who seemed to be our landlord's chief companion and confidant. We found the knight sitting on a couch, with his crutches by his side, and his feet supported on cushions, but he received us with a hearty welcome, and seemed greatly rejoiced at our arrival. After tea, we were entertained with a sonata on the harpsichord by Lady Bulford, who sung and played to admiration, but Sir Thomas seemed to be a little asinine in the article of ears, though he affected to be in raptures, and begged his wife to favour us with an arietta of her own composing. This arietta, however, she no sooner began to perform, than he and the justice fell asleep, but the moment she ceased playing, the knight waked snorting, and exclaimed, "O Cara! What do ye think, gentlemen? Will you talk any more of your Pargo Lessi and your Corelli?" At the same time, he thrust his tongue in one cheek, and leered with one eye at the doctor and me, who sat on his left hand. He concluded the pantomime with a loud laugh, which he could command at all times extempore. Notwithstanding his disorder, he did not do penance at supper, nor did he ever refuse his glass when the toast went round, but rather encouraged a quick circulation, both by precept and example. I soon perceived the doctor had made himself very necessary to the baronet. He was the whetstone of his wit, the butt of his satire, and his operator in certain experiments of humour, which were occasionally tried upon strangers. Justice Frogmore was an excellent subject for this species of philosophy, sleek and corpulent, solemn, and shallow. He had studied Burn with uncommon application, but he studied nothing so much as the art of living, that is, eating. Well, this fat buck had often afforded good sport to our landlord, and he was frequently started with tolerable success, in the course of this evening, but the baronet's appetite for ridicule seemed to be chiefly excited by the appearance, address, and conversation of Lismahago, whom he attempted in all different modes of exposition. But he put me in mind of a contest that I once saw betwixt a young hound and an old hedgehog. The dog turned him over and over, and bounced and barked, and mumbled, but as often as he attempted to bite, he felt a prickle in his jaws, and recoiled in manifest confusion. The captain, when left to himself, will not fail to turn his ludicrous side to the company, but if any man attempts to force him into that attitude, he becomes stubborn as a mule, and unmanageable as an elephant unbroke. Divers tolerable jokes were cracked upon the justice, who eat a most unconscionable supper, and, among other things, a large plate of broiled mushrooms, which he had no sooner swallowed than the doctor observed, with great gravity, that they were of the kind called champignons, which in some constitutions has a poisonous effect. Mr. Frogmore, startled at this remark, asked, in some confusion, why he had not been so kind as to give him that notice sooner. He answered, that he took it for granted, by his eating them so heartily, that he was used to the dish, but as he seemed to be under some apprehension, he prescribed a bumper of plague water, which the justice drank off immediately, and retired to rest, not without marks of terror and disquiet. At midnight we were shown to our different chambers, and in half an hour, I was fast asleep in bed, but about 3 o'clock in the morning I was waked with a dismal cry of fire. And starting up, ran to the window in my shirt. The night was dark and stormy, and a number of people half-dressed ran backwards and forwards through the courtyard, with links and lanthorns, seemingly in the utmost hurry and trepidation. Slipping on my clothes in a twinkling, I ran downstairs, and, upon inquiry, found the fire was confined to a back stair, which led to a detached apartment where Lismahago lay. By this time, the lieutenant was alarmed by bawling at his window, which was in the second story, but he could not find his clothes in the dark, and his room door was locked on the outside. The servants called to him, that the house had been robbed, that, without all doubt, the villains had taken away his clothes, fastened the door, and set the house on fire, for the staircase was in flames. In this dilemma the poor lieutenant ran about the room naked like a squirrel in a cage, popping out his bead at the window between whiles, and imploring assistance. At length, the knight in person was brought out in his chair, attended by my uncle and all the family, including our Aunt Tabitha, who screamed, and cried, and tore her hair, as if she had been distracted. Sir Thomas had already ordered his people to bring a long ladder which was applied to the captain's window, and now he exhorted him earnestly to descend. There was no need of much rhetoric to persuade Lismahago, who forthwith made his exit by the window, roaring all the time to the people below to hold fast the ladder. Notwithstanding the gravity of the occasion, it was impossible to behold this scene without being seized with an inclination to laugh. The rueful aspect of the lieutenant in his shirt, with a quilted nightcap fastened under his chin, and his long lank limbs and posteriors exposed to the wind, made a very picturesque appearance, when illumined by the links and torches which the servants held up to light him in his descent. All the company stood round the ladder, except the knight, who sat in his chair, exclaiming from time to time, "Lord, have mercy upon us!" Save the gentleman's life! Mind your footing, dear captain! Softly! Stand fast, clasp the ladder with both hands! There! Well done, my dear boy! Oh bravo! An old soldier forever! Bring a blanket, bring a warm blanket to comfort his poor carcass, warm the bed in the green room, give me your hand, dear captain, I'm rejoiced to see thee safe and sound with all my heart. Lismahago was received at the foot of the ladder by his inamorata, who snatching a blanket from one of the maids, wrapped it about his body. 2 men servants took him under the arms, and a female conducted him to the green room, still accompanied by Mrs. Tabitha, who saw him fairly put to bed. During this whole transaction he spoke not a syllable, but looked exceeding grim, sometimes at one, sometimes at another of the spectators, who now adjourned in a body to the parlour where we had supped, every one surveying another with marks of astonishment and curiosity. The knight being seated in an easy chair, seized my uncle by the hand, and bursting into a long and loud laugh, "Mat," cried he, "crown me with oak, or ivy, or laurel, or parsley, or what you will, and acknowledge this to be a coup de maître in the way of waggery, ha, ha, ha!" Such a camisciata, scagliata, biffata. Oh, che roba! Oh, what a subject! Oh, what caricatura! Oh, for a Rosa, a Rembrandt, a Schocken, Zooks, I'll give 100 guineas to have it painted! What a fine descent from the cross, or ascent to the gallows! What lights and shadows! What a group below! What expression above! What an aspect! Did you mind the aspect? Ha, ha, ha! And the limbs, and the muscles, every toe denoted terror. Ha, ha, ha! Then the blanket. Oh, what costume! St. Andrew. Street Lazarus. Street Barabbas! Ha, ha, ha! After all then, cried Mr. Bramble very gravely, this was no more than a false alarm. We have been frightened out of our beds, and almost out of our senses, for the joke's sake." "And such a joke!" cried our landlord, "such a farce! Such a denouement! Such a catastrophe!" "Have a little patience," replied our squire, "we are not yet come to the catastrophe, and pray God it may not turn out a tragedy instead of a farce. The captain is one of those saturnine subjects, who have no idea of humor. He never laughs in his own person, nor can he bear that other people should laugh at his expense. Besides, if the subject had been properly chosen, the joke was too severe in all conscience." "'Sdeath!" cried the knight, "I could not have baited him an ace had he been my own father, and as for the subject, such another does not present itself once in half a century." Here Mrs. Tabitha interposing, and bridling up, declared, she did not see that Mr. Lismahago was a fitter subject for ridicule than the knight himself, and that she was very much afraid he would very soon find he had mistaken his man. The baronet was a good deal disconcerted by his intimation, saying, that he must be a Goth and a barbarian, if he did not enter into the spirit of such a happy and humorous contrivance. He begged, however, that Mr. Bramble and his sister would bring him to reason, and this request was reinforced by Lady Bulford, who did not fail to read the baronet a lecture upon his indiscretion, which lecture he received with submission on one side of his face, and a leer upon the other. We now went to bed for the second time, and before I got up, my uncle had visited Lismahago in the green room, and used such arguments with him, that when we met in the parlour he seemed to be quite appeased. He received the knight's apology with good grace, and even professed himself pleased at finding he had contributed to the diversion of the company. Sir Thomas shook him by the hand, laughing heartily, and then desired a pinch of snuff, in token of perfect reconciliation. The lieutenant, putting his hand in his waistcoat pocket, pulled out, instead of his own Scotch mull, a very fine gold snuff-box, which he no sooner perceived than he said, "Here is a small mistake." "No mistake at all," cried the baronet, "a fair exchange is no robbery. Oblige me so far, Captain, as to let me keep your mull as a memorial." "Sir," said the lieutenant, "the mull is much at your service, but this machine I can by no means retain. It looks like compounding a sort of felony in the code of honor. Besides, I don't know but there may be another joke in this conveyance, and I don't find myself disposed to be brought upon the stage again. I won't presume to make free with your pockets, but I beg you will put it up again with your own hand." So saying, with a certain austerity of aspect, he presented the snuff-box to the knight, who received it in some confusion, and restored the mull, which he would by no means keep except on the terms of exchange. This transaction was like to give a grave cast to the conversation, when my uncle took notice that Mr. Justice Frogmore had not made his appearance either at the night album, or now at the general rendezvous. The baronet, hearing Frogmore mentioned, "Also," cried he, "I had forgot the justice. Worthy doctor, go and bring him out of his kennel." Then, laughing till his sides were well shaken, he said he would show the captain that he was not the only person of the drama exhibited for the entertainment of the company. As to the night scene, it could not affect the justice, who had been purposely lodged in the farther end of the house, remote from the noise, and lulled with a dose of opium into the bargain. In a few minutes, Mr. Justice was led into the parlour in his nightcap and loose morning gown, rolling his head from side to side, and groaning piteously all the way. "Jesu, neighbour Frogmore," exclaimed the baronet, "what is the matter? You look as if you was not a man for this world." Set him down softly on the couch, poor gentleman! Lord have mercy upon us! What makes him so pale, and yellow, and bloated? "Oh, Sir Thomas," cried the justice, "I doubt 'tis all over with me. Those mushrooms I eat at your table have done my business." "Ah! Oh! Hey! Now the Lord forbid," said the other. "What? Man, have a good heart, how does thy stomach feel?" All. To this interrogation he made no reply, but throwing aside his nightgown, discovered that his waistcoat would not meet upon his belly by 5 good inches at least. "Heaven protect us all!" cried Sir Thomas, What a melancholy spectacle! ! Never did I see a man so suddenly swelled, but when he was either just dead, or just dying. Doctor, canst thou do nothing for this poor object? I don't think the case is quite desperate, said the surgeon, but I would advise Mr. Frogmore to settle his affairs with all expedition. The parson may come and pray by him, while I prepare a glyster and an emetic draught. The justice, rolling his languid eyes, ejaculated with great fervency, Lord, have mercy upon us. Christ, have mercy upon us! ! Then he begged the surgeon, in the name of God, to dispatch. As for my worldly affairs, said he, they are all settled but one mortgage, which must be left to my heirs, but my poor soul! My poor soul! What will become of my poor soul? Miserable sinner that I am! Nay, prithee, my dear boy, compose thyself, resumed the knight, consider the mercy of heaven is infinite, thou canst not have any sins of a very deep dye on thy conscience, or the devil's in't. Name not the devil, exclaimed the terrified Frogmore, I have more sins to answer for than the world dreams of. Ah! Friend, I have been sly, damned sly, send for the parson without loss of time, and put me to bed, for I am posting to eternity. He was accordingly raised from the couch, and supported by 2 servants, who led him back to his room, but before he quitted the parlor, he entreated the good company to assist him with their prayers. He added, take warning by me, who am suddenly cut off in my prime, like a flower of the field, and God forgive you, Sir Thomas, for suffering such poisonous trash to be eaten at your table. He was no sooner removed out of hearing, than the baronet abandoned himself to a violent fit of laughing, in which he was joined by the greatest part of the company, but we could hardly prevent the good lady from going to undeceive the patient, by discovering, that while he slept his waistcoat had been straightened by the contrivance of the surgeon, and that the disorder in his stomach and bowels was occasioned by some antimonial wine, which he had taken overnight, under the denomination of plague water. She seemed to think that his apprehension might put an end to his life. The knight swore he was no such chicken, but a tough old rogue, that would live long enough to plague all his neighbors. Upon inquiry, we found his character did not entitle him to much compassion or respect, and therefore we let our landlord's humor take its course. A glyster was actually administered by an old woman of the family, who had been Sir Thomas's nurse, and the patient took a draught made with oxymel of squills to forward the operation of the antimonial wine, which had been retarded by the opiate of the preceding night. He was visited by the vicar, who read prayers, and began to take an account of the state of his soul, when those medicines produced their effect, so that the parson was obliged to hold his nose while he poured forth spiritual consolation from his mouth. The same expedient was used by the knight and me, who, with the doctor, entered the chamber at this juncture, and found Frogmore enthroned on an easing chair, under the pressure of a double evacuation. The short intervals betwixt every heave he employed in crying for mercy, confessing his sins, or asking the vicar's opinion of his case, and the vicar answered, in a solemn snuffling tone, that heightened the ridicule of the scene. The emetic having done its office, the doctor interfered, and ordered the patient to be put in bed again. When he examined the ishsta, and felt his pulse, he declared that much of the virus was discharged, and, giving him a composing draught, assured him he had good hopes of his recovery. This welcome hint he received with tears of joy in his eyes, protesting, that if he should recover, he would always think himself indebted for his life to the great skill and tenderness of his doctor, whose hand he squeezed with great fervor, and thus he was left to his repose. We were pressed to stay dinner, that we might be witnesses of his resuscitation, but my uncle insisted upon our departing before noon, that we might reach this town before it should be dark. In the meantime, Lady Bulford conducted us into the garden to see a fishpond just finished, which Mr. Bramble censured as being too near the parlour, where the knight now sat by himself, dozing in an elbow chair after the fatigues of his morning achievement. In this situation he reclined, with his feet wrapped in flannel, and supported in a line with his body, when the door flying open with a violent shock, Lieutenant Lismahago rushed into the room with horror in his looks, exclaiming, "A mad dog! A mad dog!" and throwing up the window sash, leaped into the garden. Sir Thomas, waked by this tremendous exclamation, started up, and forgetting his gout, followed the lieutenant's example by a kind of instinctive impulse. He not only bolted through the window like an arrow from a bow, but ran up to his middle in the pond before he gave the least sign of recollection. Then the captain began to bawl, "Lord have mercy upon us!" Pray, take care of the gentleman! For God's sake, mind your footing, my dear boy! Get warm blankets, comfort his poor carcass, warm the bed in the green room. Lady Bulford was thunderstruck at this phenomenon, and the rest of the company gazed in silent astonishment, while the servants hastened to assist their master, who suffered himself to be carried back into the parlour without speaking a word. Being instantly accommodated with dry clothes and flannels, comforted with a cordial, and replaced in statu quo, one of the maids was ordered to chafe his lower extremities, an operation in consequence of which his senses seemed to return and his good humour to revive. As we had followed him into the room, he looked at every individual in his turn, with a certain ludicrous expression in his countenance, but fixed his eyes in particular upon Lismahago, who presented him with a pinch of snuff, and when he took it in silence, "Sir Thomas Bulford," said he, "I am much obliged to you for all your favours, and some of them I have endeavoured to repay in your own coin." "Give me thy hand," cried the baronet, "thou hast indeed paid me scot and lot, and even left a balance in my hands, for which, in presence of this company, I promise to be accountable." So saying, he laughed very heartily, and even seemed to enjoy the retaliation which had been exacted at his own expense, but Lady Bulford looked very grave, and in all probability thought the lieutenant had carried his resentment too far, considering that her husband was valetudinary, but, according to the proverb, he that will play at bowls must expect to meet with rubbers. I have seen a tame bear, very diverting when properly managed, become a very dangerous wild beast when teased for the entertainment of the spectators. As for Lismahago, he seemed to think the fright and the cold bath would have a good effect upon his patient's constitution, but the doctor hinted some apprehension that the gouty matter might, by such a sudden shock, be repelled from the extremities and thrown upon some of the more vital parts of the machine. I should be very sorry to see this prognostic verified upon our facetious landlord, who told Mrs. Tabitha at parting, that he hoped she would remember him in the distribution of the bride's favours, as he had taken so much pains to put the captain's parts and metal to the proof. After all, I am afraid our squire will appear to be the greatest sufferer by the baronet's wit, for his constitution is by no means calculated for night alarms. He has yawned and shivered all day, and gone to bed without supper, so that, as we have got into good quarters, I imagine we shall make a halt tomorrow, in which case, you will have at least 1 day's respite from the persecution of. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall. Dear Mary Jones, Miss Liddy is so good as to unclose me in a kiver as far as Gloucester, and the carrier will bring it to hand. God send us all safe to Monmouthshire, for I'm quite jaded with rambling. 'Tis a true saying, live and learn. Woman, what chuckling and changing have I seen! Well, there's nothing certain in this world. Who would have thought that, mistress, after all the pains taken for the good of her Prusa's soul, would go for to throw away her poor body? That she would cast the haze of infection upon such a carrying crow as Lashmago. As old as Matthew-Sullen, as dry as a red herring, and as poor as a starved vesel. Molly, hadst thou seen him come down the ladder, in a shirt so scanty, that it could not cover his nakedness! The young squire called him Dunkset, but he looked for all the world like Crodicap Morgan, the old tinker, that suffered at Abergavenny for stealing of kettle. Then he's a profane scuffle, and, as Mr. Clinker says, no better than an infidel, continually playing upon the Bible in the new birth. I doubt he has as little manners as money, for he can't say a civil word, Much more make me a present of a pair of gloves for goodwill, but he looks as if he wanted to be very forward and familiar. Oh, that ever a gentlewoman of years and discretion should tear her hair, and cry and disporridge herself for such an object. As the song goes, I vow she would fain have a bird that bids such a price for an owl. But, for sartain, he must have dealt with some Scotch musician to bring her to this pass. As for me, I put my trust in the Lord, and I have got a slice of wych elm sewed in the gathers of my under petticoat, and Mr. Clinker assures me, that by the new light of grease, I may deify the devil and all his works, but I knows what I knows, if mistress should take up with lash my ago, this is no sarvice for me, thank God, there's no want of places, and if it want for one thing, I would, but, no matter madam, Bayner's woman has 20 good pounds a year and perquisites, and dresses like a parson of distinction. I dined with her and the Valet de Champs, with bags and golden jackets, but there was nothing comfortable to eat, being as how they lived upon board, and having nothing but a piece of good cuddling tart and some blancmange. I was tuck with the colic, and a mercy it was that mistress had her vial of ings in the cocks. But, as I was saying, I think for sartain this match will go forward, for things are come to a crisis, and I have seen with my own bays, such smuggling, but I scorn for to exclose the secrets of the family, and if it once comes to marrying, who knows but the frolic may go round. I believes as how, Miss Liddy would have no reversion if her swan would appear, and you would be surprised, Molly, to receive a bride's fever from your humble servant, but this is all suppository, dear girl, and I have sullenly promised to Mr. Clinker, that neither man, woman, nor child shall know that Arrow said a civil thing to me in the way of infection. I hope to drink your health at Brambleton Hall, in a horn of October, before the month be out. Pray let my bed be turned once a day, and the window opened, while the weather is dry, and burn a few billets with some brush in the footman's garret, and see their mattrash be dry as a bone, for both our gentlemen have got a sad goodbye lying in damp shits at Sir Thomas Balfart's. No more at present, but my sarvice to Saul and the rest of our fellow servants, being, dear Mary Jones, always yours, Win. Jenkins October